In 1955, a Canadian family walked into a Ford dealership in Hamilton, Ontario. The salesman pointed them toward the Meteor, a full-size car, well-built, fairly priced, and available nowhere else on Earth. Not in the United States, not in Britain, only in Canada. They drove it home, and in some way that went beyond the transaction, it was theirs. A Canadian thing, made by Canadian hands, for Canadian roads. 11 years later, that same dealership was selling the same Ford, sitting in every lot from Miami to Minneapolis. The Meteor was gone. So was everything it represented. What happened in between was not a war, not a recession, not a bankruptcy. It was a single agreement signed on a January morning in 1965. 2 signatures on a document that quietly ended 3 decades of Canadian automotive identity. No bombs fell. No one marched. The press called it a victory. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what Canada actually had. After the First World War, the Canadian government built a wall around its auto industry. Tariffs made it expensive to simply ship finished vehicles north from Detroit. If you wanted to sell cars in Canada, you built them in Canada. That single policy decision had consequences nobody fully anticipated. It forced every major manufacturer to run a genuine Canadian operation, and genuine Canadian operations, over time, produced genuinely Canadian products. The Meteor was Ford Canada's flagship. A full-size car sold exclusively to Canadian buyers from 1949 onward, it was not a rebadged American Ford with a different grille. It was a distinct model, positioned and priced for the Canadian market, unavailable to any American buyer, regardless of what they were willing to pay. Ford Canada also produced the Frontenac, a compact named after the governor of New France, sold for exactly 1 model year in 1960 before it disappeared. 1 year, as if someone changed their mind. General Motors ran 2 Canadian exclusives simultaneously. The Acadian arrived in 1962 as a compact built for Canadian buyers, filling a segment GM's American lineup left open north of the border. The Beaumont slotted above it, a mid-range option that existed purely because the Canadian market had room for it, and Canadian consumers expected it. Pontiac Canada offered the Parisienne, a premium model that actually exceeded its American Pontiac equivalent in trim and positioning. Chrysler Canada sold trucks under the Fargo name, a label that meant nothing in Ohio, but was recognized on every farm road in Saskatchewan. These were not cosmetic distinctions. They reflected decades of Canadian engineers, Canadian product planners, and Canadian dealers making decisions about what Canadian buyers needed. The factories in Oshawa and Windsor and Oakville paid Canadian taxes, employed Canadian workers, and answered, at least in part, to Canadian priorities. A country that could build its own cars was a country capable of its own choices. In 1965, that capability was about to be traded away for something that looked, on paper, like progress. By the early 1960s, the argument against the Canadian auto industry was easy to make and largely accurate. The tariff wall had done its job too well. Canadian plants were producing short runs of multiple models for a market 1/10 the size of the American one. The economics were brutal. A Meteor built in Oakville cost significantly more per unit to produce than a comparable Ford built in Dearborn, simply because the volumes were lower and the supply chain was shorter. Canadian consumers were paying a premium for the privilege of buying Canadian, whether they knew it or not. In Washington, The Kennedy and then Johnson administrations had a solution: continental integration. One production system stretching from Ontario to Texas, rationalized and efficient, with each plant building one thing at scale instead of several things in small batches. The Americans framed it as partnership. The subtext was consolidation. The Pearson government was receptive. Canada in the early 1960s was modernizing, self-consciously shedding the image of a protected, semi-colonial economy. The auto sector looked like exactly the kind of inefficient legacy structure that a forward-looking government should fix. Trade liberalization was the language of progress. Saying yes to Washington felt like saying yes to the future. The public case was built carefully and presented confidently. The new agreement would lower production costs. It would bring more investment into Canadian plants. It would create jobs and reduce car prices for ordinary Canadian families. Ministers stood at podiums and cited projections. The numbers were real enough to be convincing. What was never placed on the podium was the underlying logic of what they were agreeing to. Rationalization meant eliminating duplication. Canadian exclusive models were, by definition, duplication. No politician stood up in the House of Commons and said that the Meteor's days were numbered, that the Fargo nameplate would be retired, that within a decade Canadian buyers would have no automotive identity distinct from their American neighbors. The price of efficiency was identity, and the government signed the bill before anyone thought to read that part aloud. On January 16, 1965, Lester Pearson and Lyndon Johnson signed the Automotive Products Trade Agreement at the White House. The ceremony was brief, the handshakes were warm, and the coverage was favorable. Canada and the United States were building something together. That was the story. That was what went out over the wire. The mechanism of the agreement was straightforward. Tariffs on vehicles and automotive parts crossing the border in either direction were eliminated, provided manufacturers met certain conditions. They had to maintain a ratio of Canadian production to Canadian sales. Assembly work was protected. Investment in Canadian plants was encouraged. On paper, the Canadian industry was not being dismantled. It was being integrated. What the agreement did not protect was design. It said nothing about where decisions would be made, where engineers would sit, or which models would survive the logic of continental consolidation. It did not need to. The economics would handle that without any help from the legal text. The calculation facing every manufacturer was simple and merciless. Once tariffs disappeared, building a separate Canadian version of any model cost real money and returned nothing. The Canadian market was too small to justify unique tooling, unique parts chains, unique marketing. The rational move, the move any accountant in any boardroom would recommend, was to build one model for all of North America and ship it north or south as demand required. No executive announced the end of Canadian automotive identity. No memo was circulated with that subject line. The models simply stopped, one by one, as the new logic settled in. The Frontenac had already gone in 1960, a single model year, in retrospect reads like a warning. The Meteor followed, disappearing in 1961, briefly revived, then retired permanently as the post-Pact reality took hold. The Fargo name survived until 1972 before Chrysler Canada quietly retired it. The Acadian lasted until 1971, then was absorbed into the standard GM lineup without ceremony. The Beaumont was gone by 1969. The Parisienne held on the longest, surviving in name until 1986, but by then it was indistinguishable from its American equivalent in everything but the badge. By 1970, a Canadian walking into any dealership in the country was looking at the same cars available in Dallas and Detroit. The lots looked identical. The brochures looked identical. The choices were identical. Nothing in the agreement had required this outcome. No clause had ordered the deletion of the Meteor or the retirement of the Fargo. The agreement had simply made the survival of those models economically irrational. In the end, that was more than enough. The Canadian press greeted the Auto Pact with something close to enthusiasm. Editorial pages in January 1965 described it as a mature and necessary step, evidence that Canada was capable of negotiating on equal terms with its southern neighbor. The Globe and Mail approved. The financial press approved. Politicians from both major parties approved. There was no significant organized opposition, no coalition of manufacturers demanding protection, no public campaign to save the Meteor or keep the Fargo name alive. The agreement passed into law with the kind of broad consensus that, in retrospect, should have raised questions. The short-term numbers gave the optimists their evidence. Assembly employment in Ontario climbed through the late 1960s. Investment flowed into Canadian plants as manufacturers consolidated production and upgraded facilities. Car prices for Canadian consumers edged downward. The projections had been accurate, as far as they went. If you measured the Auto Pact by the metrics its architects chose, it was working. What those metrics did not measure was harder to quantify and easier to ignore. Canadian automotive design capability did not survive the decade. The engineers and product planners who had developed the Meteor, the Acadian, the Parisienne, the Fargo, had no institutional home once the models they served were discontinued. Their expertise dispersed. Their function was absorbed by American counterparts in Detroit, who now made decisions for the entire continental market. Canada kept the assembly lines. It surrendered the drafting tables. The consumer lost something quieter but equally real. The Canadian buyer of 1975 had no way of choosing a car that reflected a Canadian decision about what a car should be. Every option in every showroom had been designed elsewhere, engineered elsewhere, and approved elsewhere. The transaction was the same. The identity behind it was gone. An entire generation grew up without knowing the gap existed. Children born in the late 1960s came of age in a market where Canadian exclusive models were already collector curiosities, mentioned in hobbyist magazines but absent from any classroom or public conversation. The Frontenac, the Beaumont, the Fargo. These names meant nothing to a teenager buying their first car in 1982. The loss had been so quiet, so gradual, so unaccompanied by protest or ceremony that it barely registered as a loss at all. This was not unique to automobiles. Across the same decade, Canadian brands in other industries were absorbed, standardized, or quietly retired as continental integration reshaped the economy. The Auto Pact was not an exception to a Canadian pattern. It was among the clearest expressions of it. The country had traded its capacity to choose for the lower price of someone else's choice. And on the whole, it seemed satisfied with the arrangement. What the Auto Pact left behind was infrastructure without autonomy. The plants in Oshawa and Windsor and Oakville kept running. Workers kept reporting for shifts. Vehicles kept rolling off the lines and onto Canadian roads. From a distance, the industry looked intact. What had changed was invisible to anyone not paying close attention. The decisions, the designs, the choices about what to build and when to build it. All of that now happened in rooms Canadian workers would never enter, in cities Canadian taxpayers had no influence over. The assembly operations that remained were not secure. They were convenient, for as long as they stayed convenient. Every few years, a new round of contract negotiations brought the same threat from the same direction. Costs were too high. Productivity was insufficient. Without concessions, without wage freezes, without reductions in benefits accumulated over decades, the plant would be reviewed. The word reviewed meant something specific, and everyone on the line understood it. The 1980s delivered the first serious wave of cuts. Changing consumer tastes and rising competition from Japanese manufacturers put pressure on Detroit, and Detroit passed that pressure north. Canadian plants competed against each other and against American facilities for the right to assemble someone else's product. Winning that competition meant accepting lower costs. Lower costs meant fewer workers or worse conditions or both. Then came 2008. The global financial system buckled, and the Canadian government responded with a $3 billion commitment to keep GM and Chrysler operations alive in Ontario. Ministers stood at microphones and promised that the investment protected Canadian jobs, that Oshawa and Windsor and Oakville had a future. The money was real. The guarantees were not. GM closed Oshawa in 2018, 100 years after the original promise of Canadian control had been written into the sale agreement. Windsor survived, dependent on a single model line. Oakville's future remained a recurring subject of anxious speculation with each new corporate restructuring announcement. In 2020, the disruptions of the pandemic accelerated decisions that had been deferred for years. Today, the largest automotive operation in Canada belongs to Toyota, whose plant in Cambridge, Ontario, assembles vehicles designed in Japan, approved in Japan, and subject to decisions made in Japan. It employs Canadians. It generates Canadian tax revenue. By the metrics that matter to a quarterly report, it is a success. No serious political proposal has ever emerged to rebuild Canadian automotive design capacity. No party platform has called for it. No Royal Commission has studied it. The question of whether Canada should again be capable of designing its own cars has simply never entered the conversation in Ottawa or anywhere else. The assembly lines run. Everything else was settled in 1965. Go back to that Hamilton dealership. 1955. The Meteor sitting in the lot. A car you could not buy in the United States. A quiet proof that Canada made its own choices. That dealership today sells the same trucks and crossovers available in Phoenix and Atlanta. The Meteor is a collector's footnote. The Fargo is a trivia question. The Auto Pact did not steal the Canadian car industry. Canada handed it over, smiled for the cameras, and called the receipt a victory. The assembly lines still run. But the decisions crossed the border in January 1965 and never came back.